We don't always get to pick the stories that we're a part of. Actually, we rarely do. We like watching movies, we're used to them. There's the beginning, the middle, and then the end. In the beginning, there's the inciting incident that thrusts us into the action. It's kind of like Netflix. We get to choose our stories. We can choose which kind of mood we're in. Specifically, Disney Plus, we can make sure we have one that ends with a happy ending. More specifically, Hallmark Channel. If you really want to make sure that you end with a happy ending, actually, you can start with a happy ending with one of those. Unfortunately, life is not like that. We don't get to pick our stories. The coronavirus right now has been quite a shock for me. I didn't realize the loss of my routine would affect me so much. It's had somewhat of a numbing effect on me. I didn't quite notice until I saw how unproductive I was. I feel bad because some of it's on my own doing for getting behind on things, and it's not even as bad as others. It's no grand adventure. It's just simply some ordinary distress. And I'm not alone in this. The people that I've talked to are experiencing it as well. We have a case of global grief going on right now. An entire community has received an inciting incident called COVID-19, and it's put us in a story that we didn't choose. And now we're in the middle of it. So in a story, after the inciting incident comes the middle part. As the action rises, it reaches a pinnacle moment. A moment that makes all the difference. And that determines what ends up being the resolution as we see things play out. So what makes all the difference? What is that pinnacle moment? No matter what trouble you're in today you can have a pinnacle moment that makes all the difference. So think about something in your life. What kind of trouble are you in? Something that perhaps you're right in the middle of, or something that's just started. Put that in your mind and think about that. God has a lot to say to us about that today. Let's discover what He teaches us. In Psalm 107, we see a case, multiple cases, multiple stories of ordinary distress. God delivered some very ordinary people out of some very difficult situations. It caught my attention because when I first heard this story, I didn't know what it was referring to. It didn't have anything else in the Old Testament that I could think of these stories and of these individuals. The immediate implication struck me: God cares about ordinary distress. These people made it into the Bible. Ordinary stories of God's deliverance. It was no David and Goliath story, no parting of the Red Sea. And yet God authored these stories, just like He is authoring my stories and your stories. The beginning of this psalm shares the theme. It starts with it, it ends with it, and it repeats it as a refrain throughout the entire psalm. In verse 1 in the ESV it says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His steadfast love endures forever." That line right there will repeat throughout this psalm. That His steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom He has redeemed from trouble, and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and to the south. We arrive now to our first story of this psalm. There's 4 in total. The first one is a story about some people in the desert. It says in verse 4, "Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to a city to dwell in. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble." This is the pinnacle moment for them. The inciting incident is that they're wasting away in a desert. We've seen this image in movies oftentimes. It's a hopeless picture. And yet, in the moment that made all the difference, they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and He delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way till they reached a city to dwell in. And then in resolution of the story, it says, "Let them thank the Lord for His steadfast love." The next story is a story about, it's the image of being captive in a dungeon. We've seen this in the movies we've watched. It says here, some sat in darkness and in the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons. For they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. So he bowed their hearts down with hard labor. They fell down with none to help. And then the moment that made all the difference, it says, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and God delivered them from their distress. And then in resolution, it says, he brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and burst their bonds apart. And then in resolution it says, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love. Our third story, it's the image of deathly ailment, of sickness. It says, some were fools through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities suffered affliction. They loathed any kind of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them, and delivered them from their destruction. Again here you see the pinnacle moment. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble. He delivered them. He sent out his word and healed them. Then in resolution it says, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love. And our last story from Psalm 107 is out at sea, sinking. What a terrifying feeling that would be. Again, we see this in the movies we watch. It says, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to the heavens, and they went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, and were at their wits' end. And then we come to the pinnacle moment of the story. The moment that made all the difference. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to the desired haven. And in the resolution it says, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love. The end of the psalm, God shows that he can turn any situation on its head. Good to bad, bad to good. Ultimate authority is his. Verses 39 through 41 say that God will work in our story to humble and pour contempt on the proud and the wicked, and to bless and raise up the needy. And finally, in the last verse of this psalm, it says, whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord. So what did this mean for the original audience? This was written to Jews that had just come back from exile. God's people, partly to their own fault, like we see in this psalm at times, had been tragically overcome and deported from Babylon to Babylon. Lamentations chapter 2 says that their wound, it was as deep as the sea. And it says that they should pour their hearts out like water before God. This poem was to them a victory song as they had returned back to the land. God had delivered them. They returned with Nehemiah and Ezra. These 4 stories would resonate with them. I believe that these stories really happened to specific people, but that these individuals that had returned would then resonate with these stories as they came from the north, the south, east, and west, some from boats, some through the desert. Some had been captives. Some were wasting away in sickness and the poverty of Jerusalem. God, just as he promised through the prophets, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, and even in the law and Moses himself, restored Israel to their land when God's people humbled themselves and prayed and sought his face and turned from their wicked ways. As 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, that God heard from heaven and forgave their sin and healed their land. So what would this imagery of this poem mean for Jews in the time of Jesus? Stories are catchy, they're sticky. You remember the imagery. And the Jews studied their Bibles. They would have sung this psalm often. They would be waiting once again to be restored as a nation. In a way, they were in exile again under Roman rule in the time of Jesus. So what did people think when Jesus, similar to the story of the desert in this psalm, when Jesus went to the wilderness and fed the 5,000, what would they have thought about that? Or perhaps, what would the synagogue have thought when Jesus, similar to the story of the captives in the dungeon in this psalm, what would the synagogue have thought when Jesus on a Sabbath took the scroll and read out of Isaiah, "He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners"? What would Paul and Silas have thought when the doors of their jail cell swung wide open? Or what would the blind and the lame and the mute think when Jesus, similar to the third story of this psalm about those in sickness, were healed? What about the woman when her internal wasting disease touched the hem of Jesus' garment and was healed? Or when the leper was healed? What about the synagogue ruler when Jesus raised his daughter back from the dead? Or when he raised Lazarus from the dead? Perhaps these images, the imagery of these poems would be fresh on their minds. Or what would his disciples have thought when Jesus, similar to this psalm, calmed the raging sea? Well, they were astonished and they were terrified, and they asked the question, who is this? The imagery of the Old Testament, of Old Testament deliverance, such as this psalm, is imprinted across all of Jesus' life. And just like when he calmed the storm, we, like the disciples, should pause and wonder, who is this that has authority to provide such deliverance? It's not just enough to study the Bible and ponder what it means for someone else. What does it mean for you? Perhaps you feel like you're at the beginning of a story in your life. In a way, we all are in this coronavirus. But what other kind of trouble might you be in today? What was the story of trouble that you thought of at the beginning of this sermon? He already knows that situation, but has he heard your voice? Have you cried out to the Lord in your trouble? Perhaps you resonate with the first story of being in a desert, wasting away, drying up. Maybe this time of isolation has you withering. Maybe the relationships in your life seem to be withering and drying up. Maybe there's relationships in your family at home that you see every day that seem to be withering. Verse 7 says, he can lead you by a straight way till you have reached a city to dwell in. And verse 9 says, for he can satisfy your longing soul, and your hungry soul he can fill with good things. Perhaps you resonate with the second story of this psalm, being stuck in a dungeon. Verse 14 says, he can bring you out of darkness and the shadow of death and burst your bonds apart. And verse 16 says, for he can shatter the doors of bronze and cut in two the bars of iron. Perhaps he can bring you out of an addiction in that way. Perhaps, like the third story, you are struggling with sickness. Verse 20 says, he can send out his word and heal you and deliver you from your destruction. And the last story, the story of the sea going up to the heavens and down to the depths. Maybe there's things in your life that feel like that. Maybe it's your finances. You're afraid they're taking a plunge and you're going under. Verse 29 through 30 says, for he can make your storm still and hush your waves. He can quiet your waters and bring you to a safe haven. Perhaps you're ready for a moment that makes all the difference. Perhaps you're ready to get your pinnacle moment. Today can be your moment. If you cry to the Lord like Israel did in their distress, when they were in exile, they cried to the Lord. And this passage says that he gathered them to himself into the land, and he brought them from the four corners of the earth back to himself. He will do that for you. Even if your wound is deeper than the sea, pour your heart out like water before him. The Lord has ultimate authority to flip situations on their head. Like verses 39 through 41 indicate, he will humble and pour contempt on the proud and the wicked. But if you cry to the Lord in trouble, he will deliver you from your distress, for he blesses and raises up the needy. Perhaps you feel like you're at the end of a story right now. You're at the resolution. Then thank God for it. Something my mother used to say and still says is that life is kind of like a train track with two rails, one good and one bad. And often our stories overlap with each other. As we're coming out of one, we're going into another. Perhaps there's trouble you're coming into and something else you're coming out. Remember the steadfast love of the Lord and how he has brought you out time and time again. This passage, the last verse, says that it's wise to consider the steadfast love of the Lord. So remember. And lastly, we're all in this together. We can help each other. What would it look like as a Christian community if we all faced the coronavirus together? If we went through these phases in our stories together? On a grand scale, we all are in the same boat. We have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the biggest story ever told, the grand narrative of all of history, our beginning puts us in that place. And we're in the middle of that story. And our pinnacle moment is when our knees hit the floor and we cry out to the Lord in our trouble. He will deliver us. What would it look like for us to come to the resolution of our story together? The hope that we have when God gathers us to the land that he promised. When he splits open the sky and creates the new heaven and the new earth, and we get to live with him forever. That we can thank him for all eternity, that the redeemed of the Lord might say so. So whatever story you're in, remember, there's three parts. And in the middle of it, the moment that makes all the difference is to cry out to the Lord in your trouble. For his steadfast love endures forever.